Hi everybody, my name is Jen and I'm making this video to talk about the troubled teen industry and institutional abuse of minors, which is a huge problem in the United States at least, that is affecting countless youth and has been for decades. It's shockingly little talked about and so prevalent that I felt that maybe if I could give the information and tell my story, it might help educate parents and maybe keep some kids safe. Over the past 35 years, at least 145 kids have died from avoidable causes in residential treatment centers, including at least 62 from asphyxiation or injury while being restrained. So I'm going to start this video by actually talking a little bit about what the troubled teen industry is, what started it, what it looks like now, and then in the second part of this video I will tell my story, and I will put up a timestamp so that you can skip to that part if that's what you're here for. But I'd like to encourage you to listen to the information as well. So what is the troubled teen industry? It's pretty much what it sounds like. It's the system in place that provides treatment and therapy for adolescents and youth who are either struggling with mental illness, behavioral problems, and in a lot of cases, actually normal adolescent behavior. There are at least 1,000 residential treatment centers in the United States currently. And residential treatment centers are long-term care facilities that hold children anywhere from months to years. And in the system right now, there are over 60,000 children being kept in residential treatment programs every year. So this is a system in place for parents who are basically at the end of their rope. You know, they feel that they can't control their child has behavioral issues, ranging anywhere from problems in school due to ADHD, or as I like to call it, just being probably a creative kid who doesn't actually have ADHD or ADD, but to ranging to kids who were like I was when I was 13, which is, really major depression, suicidal tendencies, and I mean to kids dealing with homicidal behavior and abusive behavior of their own. So these parents, feeling like they have nowhere left to go, will send their children away to these facilities, often out of state, and the children are kept for anywhere from 3 months to 3 years, and it can be much more. So the interesting part of this story, well, there's so many interesting parts of the story, but one of them is how this whole thing started. The teen treatment industry as we see it today actually started with a recovery cult in the 1960s called Synanon. Some of you may know about this story. Synanon was a recovery program that turned into a cult, basically. It spawned off from the 12-step program, Alcoholics Anonymous, and developed into a spin-off which began to include a kind of bash therapy where people would gather in a room, and the version of group therapy would be that they would yell and berate each other until they had properly broken down the person and made them open enough to receive the wisdom of the treatment. It evolved eventually to start shaving the heads of cult members, swapping partners, taking them away from their long-term partners and forcing relationships with other partners. It was a weird mess, and fortunately did not last. But before Synanon shut down, it inspired a couple of programs which became youth treatment facilities. So kids were sent into these facilities and went through much the same situation where they were forced into these bash therapy sessions, physical abuse, forced cuddling, all kinds of insanity. And that seed grew into the huge list of facilities and organizations that run still today. While a lot has changed, the model is not far off from where it began. And this whole thing gained a lot of momentum in the 80s and 90s as the drug war ramped up in the Reagan administration. And there was a lot of paranoia in the media about teen behavior. I mean, we were really given the picture that our adolescent youth are really going to the pits. Their drug use is skyrocketing, that criminal behavior is skyrocketing, and in reality it was actually declining for a lot of that period. And it gave a picture to parents that all of our kids are in trouble, that everybody is susceptible to falling into these delinquent ways, and the best way to deal with this, as it was peddled to them, is with tough love, to make sure that these kids fly straight. And actually, Nancy Reagan, the first lady of the time, really supported and praised these programs like Straight Inc. And kind of pushed to parents the tough love concept that if they can get the child to submit, obey, and learn these positive behaviors, it would prevent the kid from becoming a delinquent. And so it really, the residential treatment industry and the troubled teen industry got its roots in deep during that time, and it shows no signs of going anywhere. So what is the problem? There is treatment needed for kids that have severe mental, emotional, behavioral issues that can't be handled at home. Part of the problem is that many of these kids don't need the kind of treatment that they're being sent away for. But for the ones who are, they do need treatment. There does need to be somewhere that these kids can be safe and receive therapy and get the specialized kind of care that they need. These programs are notoriously abusive, from isolation practices to medical neglect, physical and emotional abuse. It's more than I can talk about at this moment. Let's continue with the information part of this. All that to say, a lot of these programs have been shut down due to abuse. I'm looking at my cue cards here. If I don't follow my list, I'm going to start rambling again, and this whole thing will be a train wreck. But some of these abuses would include neglect, wrongful death, illegal operations, sexual abuse for sure. And the ones that shut down oftentimes are actually just reopening under different names or different organizations, different locations, but are being run by the same people. The same players that have been in this industry from the early days are often directly involved with or directly connected to the people who are running the facilities now. So even though the faces change and the names change, the places change, the connections are still the same and the model is still the same. A really good example of this would be an actually pretty extreme example, which is Tranquility Bay. Tranquility Bay was a residential treatment facility, run by Americans in Jamaica. It took children as young as 12, and it was shut down for illegal operations involving the documentation of these kids, but it was completely surrounded by very serious testimony from both students and adults and staff of abuse. Some of these abuses were children being beaten until they had bones shattered and then medically neglected. Serious neglect. You can see in the photos the kinds of humiliation tactics and the environment that these children were being kept in. And so while it was shut down, the people who ran this facility continue to run facilities today and continue to be connected to facilities today that are based on the same model. And unlike Tranquility Bay, almost all are located in the United States. where some of the neglect issues are obviously dealt with because it's in the US and we can see it. Part of the problem with Tranquility Bay was that when the United States Embassy would come to inspect the facility, they would actually just take the kids who showed physical signs of abuse and neglect and remove them from the property during that inspection so that the US Embassy wouldn't see what was going on. And this kind of evasiveness, this kind of calculated approach to avoiding allegations of abuse and bad press is very commonplace in this whole industry. So a lot of these facilities are funded by state money, by church money, and are actually often in contract with school districts to encourage and generate referrals to their programs. It's become so big that it's really become the only option for parents who are in this situation. If you have a child who has a history of suicidal ideation or actions, there are very few places that are going to take your child for some kind of inpatient treatment other than a short stay mental hospital. And so these facilities are offering those parents that place. They're saying, okay, send your child here. We will allow them in our program. We will take them, we will fix them, we will heal them, and we'll return them back to you in much better condition. And for the lucky kids, like, they may get some help and they may come out fairly unscathed. But for the majority, it's at the very least a traumatic experience because of the kinds of tactics that they use. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a little bit. But really what makes this flourish is the way that they are advertising this to parents. You know, they'll show you videos of the beautiful, or, you know, at least up to par facility, the way the bedrooms look, the way the common areas look, all the fun outdoor off-campus activities they'll take your kids to. They talk about the kind of therapy that they'll receive and group therapy and drug treatment. And it's truly, in most cases, a facade. The parent wants so badly for the kid to be okay, and they're offered this solution that not only alleviates the kind of stress and pain that they're experiencing in their own lives, but gives the promise that their kid is going to be okay, that maybe they'll come home better and obedient and healthy. So, you know, what really happens is that you may receive therapy once a week. However, you're receiving therapy from a therapist who is not in a traditional therapist role. Usually your therapist is supposed to be an unbiased outsider who can come in and listen to you and help you, you know, explore yourself and find some direction and find some healing. The therapists in these programs have authority over their patients. So it is not a patient-therapist relationship. It's really more of a superior power issue where, yes, you talk to your therapist, but if you say the wrong thing, or if you reveal too much, or if you're not going along with the program the way that they feel that you need to at that moment, you can actually receive punishments based on your therapist's wishes for you. That can be anything from being placed on a no talking standing order where you cannot communicate with anybody around you, and receive other forms of punishment for breaking that contract and looking at other kids for too long or trying to communicate in any way, to being placed on, you know, at least at the facility that I went to, being placed on a unit called investment, where you were taken away from the greater population and placed into a smaller unit, usually housed, you know, up to like 30 girls. And you pretty much just had to sit at a desk all day long, and sit structure. So that means, like, you have to sit straight with your hands up on the desk, your feet flat on the floor, and either be working on homework or sit there silently. And, for a teenager to do that for, hours upon hours is a pretty decent punishment. And so the therapist has the power to do this. And it completely corrupts the patient-therapist relationship and affects the way that the child is going to talk to the therapist and the way that the patient is going to relate to the therapist. And that's a across the board issue. That's what's happening in all of these facilities, is that the therapist is not a therapist, but a staff member with the power to punish your child for their feelings and for their communications with the therapist. And what parents don't see is everything that really happens behind those walls. They may get reports back from the therapist or from the staff about, going on a hiking trip, or that if the child can just earn their levels, they'll get to go to this activity or that activity. And what's really happening is that very, very, very few of these kids are going outside those walls. I mean, we may go outside for a short period of time, half an hour to an hour, once a week, if we're lucky. Otherwise, at least in my facility, we were indoors at all times and not allowed to look out the windows. Where to go from here? I think this gives you a pretty decent picture of at least where this is coming from and a little bit of what it's looking like today. But how is this happening? So how is it that these kids are going into facilities where they're meant to be cared for and given therapy and are oftentimes receiving abuse? There are so many stories from so many facilities about physical abuse, isolation practices, serious emotional and mental abuse, and neglect. Neglect to the point of death in some situations. And the best parallel that I can draw to this problem, and I'm definitely not the first to draw this parallel, relates to the Stanford prison experiment of 1971. You may have seen there was a recent film done on this experiment by the same name, the Stanford prison experiment. So the Stanford prison experiment was done by a psych professor named Philip Zimbardo in 1971, where he recruited volunteers from Stanford University and assigned them at random both to be prison guards or prisoners. And they set up a mock prison. They had these students, all in there together for a period of time. And he and the staff instructed the prison guards to maintain psychological authority over the prisoners. So they were given some direction, but they were really experimenting with the effects of perceived power. That when you put an average person in a position of power and authority over another group of people, what is that going to look like? What happens? And I believe it ran for 6 days before it was shut down for moral reasons, because the students that were given the assignment of being prison guards very, very quickly declined into extremely abusive, sadistic behavior. They were stripping prisoners of their clothes for humiliation practices. They would pit them against each other and reward prisoners for inflicting abuse on other prisoners. They would not allow them to empty their buckets of waste and really force them to live amongst buckets of waste for that time. Rejecting opportunities for food, beds, all kinds of things. And it really painted a picture of how strong that pull to power is and what it can do to a person. And I think that it's a great example because it really shows a good picture of what's happening in these facilities. Almost all of these facilities are staffed primarily with college-aged youth, and then a few senior staff members who are, for the most part, burnt out by the nature of the work or have been desensitized to the nature of the work over the years. And these staff are undertrained. They're vastly unsupported by their superiors, and they're being put into a situation where they're supposed to maintain their authority in a huge group of kids, as many as they can legally put in the building, with vastly different issues. You have kids in there, like I said, for anything from scholastic issues to chasing their parents around the house with knives. You have kids in there who are struggling because of long-term sexual abuse, and you have students in there who are in there because they have abused other children. So you're putting these young people, these staff members are often, not more than 6 years older than the children that they're in charge of, who aren't fully trained, who don't know how to do it, are scared a little bit, and are trying to maintain their authority. And it leads to situations with just extreme reactions and abuse of power. I'll get into my story more, but part of what happened to me did include physical abuse, being dragged, and I witnessed worse happen to other kids. The way that kids are tackled to the ground, the way that they're restrained, and the severity of these incidents is wide. From little things to children dying in these facilities. But it's across the board, pretty well known, at least to the members of the community who have been in these facilities. Like, we all know that this happens. We all either saw it or experienced it. And for the few who didn't, it's kind of hard to even imagine. So why are these staff so undertrained? Why is this happening? Because for upper management, profit is the bottom line. These are for-profit facilities. They are making money on this. There are huge networks of these. The majority of these facilities are actually owned by the same company, the same umbrella organization. And I'm not going to get into that for my own protection, but I would encourage you to do some research and learn about this on your own. So today, while things have improved a lot from what happened back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, the problems are still very much there. Isolation is misused, as I've talked about. Restraint is misused. Physical abuse occurs. Sexual abuse definitely occurs. And the kind of emotional trauma that children come away from these facilities with is oftentimes on par with the kinds of trauma that caused them to be there to begin with. One thing that I've seen often in conversations between survivors and other people who have been in these facilities is the nightmares, that we all seem to have nightmares. We all struggle with symptoms, related to post-traumatic stress disorder. And none of us talk about it openly. Let me correct myself. There are people who talk about it, but not enough of us are talking about it openly because we're afraid. We grew up in a situation where if we tried to speak up, we were punished for it. We were discredited. We were made to feel that, and rightly so, that if we spoke up, the only person that was going to suffer or be corrected for that would be ourselves. And I think a lot of us carry that mentality into adulthood. And also, it's a hard thing to talk about. It's a hard thing to say, I was a troubled kid and I was abused for it. But I think that it's important that we do say something. And for that reason, in part 2 of this video, I will tell my story. Okay, I'm back. Different day, same hat, and I'm going to do my best to tell you my story today. And I want to tell my story not because it's unique, but because of how not unique it is. I think that my experiences in treatment centers really gives a picture of what's happened to so many others like me and what's still happening to children today. And I will do my best to tell it all as it relates to the troubled teen industry and not say too much or too little. So bear with me. Where do I start? Well, I grew up in Southern California in a family that had privilege by all means. And I was lucky to be very much loved and very much cared about. And I was a pretty happy kid. I was very talkative, very creative and imaginative, and relatively social. And I had a lot of memory of joy from when I was a little kid. But when I was about 8 or 9 years old, there was a lot of tragedy in my family. And, you know, I witnessed the death of a close relative, and it changed a lot for myself and for my family. You know, we all struggled after that. And, you know, as an unfortunate coincidence for me, during that same time, there were other things happening to me that my parents didn't know about until years later. And I don't need to go into details about all of that, but suffice it to say that, you know, there was a series of traumatic events that culminated in me becoming, you know, increasingly more and more depressed, to the point that I was suicidal when I was 13. And I was medicated starting at age 10. I was started on a small dose of antidepressants, and then shortly after I was put on Adderall because of my distraction and disinterest in school. You know, they thought that I had ADD, so they started giving me speed. And not surprisingly, after that, I developed problems sleeping. I became pretty severely insomniac, and developed an eating disorder as well. Basically, I just stopped eating. So by the time I was 13, the picture had gotten pretty grim. I was really deeply depressed. I was carrying a lot of weight and a lot of symptoms from this PTSD that hadn't been diagnosed yet because of everything that had happened. And when I tried to kill myself, I was then hospitalized at a UCLA psychiatric ward for adolescents and juveniles. I spent about a month there, and to be honest, was mostly treated well. I think I just badly needed help, so any help was good help at that moment. And when I was released, I ran away. And when I was recovered from that, my parents sent me to a behavioral modification center. It was not an easy choice for them by any means. They were terrified that I was either going to kill myself or that I was going to disappear, and that they wouldn't have access to me to help me or keep me safe. And they were advised by some of their peers. An interesting point of my story is that both of my parents are or were mental health professionals themselves. So they were given the advice to send me to this specific behavioral modification program in Utah, and they made the difficult decision to do that. They were promised that I was going to be given a lot of therapy and a lot of help, and that getting me out of the environment that I was in and giving me essentially a fresh start would really, you know, be the ticket to helping me get through the depth of problems that I was dealing with at that young age. And so I was sent to this behavioral modification center, and I guess to give you a picture of what it looks like to go in, you know, I was brought in and, you know, taken behind the first set of locked doors and brought to a utility closet where they strip searched me, which was a new experience in my life at that time. And you're put in a pair of sweats. They called them pinks and yellows where I went, and mostly these were really ratty, nasty pink and yellow sweats. Sometimes you'd luck out and get leftover athletic clothes. So you're placed in these sweats. You're given, books of worksheets and things to study and fill out so that you can learn the structure and the rules and the things that are expected of you in the facility. And shortly after I arrived, they don't do this to everyone, but they did it to me and to other girls that I remember later on. They shaved my head. And they shaved my head because I had a weird haircut, and they felt that it was too attention grabbing, so they shaved mine. I was given a number, as we were all given numbers. It's inscribed into your clothes, into everything you own, so that they can keep track of you and your belongings. They have strict rules that you are not to be called by your first name. You're referred to by last name only. And you'd always know when you'd found a friend if they were brave enough to ask you for your first name and would call you by your first name when nobody was paying attention. So it was a shock, definitely. I mean, you're walking in lines everywhere. Everything that you do is controlled. You can't do anything, including go to the bathroom, without asking for express permission. And in my situation, being watched during that time as well. And you stay in those sweats, the pinks and yellows, until you've earned what they call a status, until you've achieved enough that they deem that you can go ahead and have your clothes back. So you're kind of marked for being either a newbie or for being lower status by being in those pinks and yellows. So, an interesting point, actually a peer pointed this out to me recently, it's something that I sometimes forget, is that after they had my head shaved, I didn't realize it was going on until someone pointed it out to me. But apparently, because of my appearance, because of my bald head and how thin I was, and also because of the fact that I came from a Jewish home, some of the staff members were referring to me by the nickname Auschwitz. That's how they would describe me over the radio to each other, to describe, they'd say Auschwitz is on investment, or Auschwitz is on unit 2. And so that kind of paints a picture of the kinds of professionals that I was working with during that period. But all in all, during that stay, I think I just so desperately needed help that I was willing to do anything. Okay, I'll walk in line, I'll do whatever you tell me to do. I just don't want to feel like this anymore. And I lucked out and got a therapist who really did care, and who was doing his best to help us in the ways that he could. And I know that he continued to be a good face there until he resigned. And so while it was difficult, and while things happened that would for some people be shocking, I never think back on that period of time as having been abusive in the way that it was later. After 15 months in the program, I was returned home, and I was required to, they give you a home contract is what they call it. So like a set of agreements that you make with your parents that are conditional on you coming home. And those are things like, you're going to listen to your parents, you're going to obey by this curfew, you're going to check in with them about everything. And for me, some of those things were that I would go to NA or AA meetings, which is a little bit insane because I definitely was not an addict or an alcoholic. And this is really, really, really common with these things, is that because I didn't take my Adderall as directed a few times, and because I had been, because I had drunk alcohol a number of times when I was a young adolescent, they funnel you directly into the 12-step program. They decide that you are an addict or an alcoholic, and they drive that point home and get you involved in the program. And so that was part of mine, was that they basically convinced me that I was an alcoholic drug addict at 13 years old, and that I needed to attend meetings for the rest of my life to be any semblance of okay. So I went home really kind of believing a lot of this, that I needed to go to these meetings, and that I needed to show my parents that I was normal and that I could handle it and that I was healthy. And what I didn't anticipate was just how institutionalized I had become. I was there for 15 months, and that's a long time for, you know, a 13-year-old girl. It was very weird to go back and not ask anybody to go to the bathroom, and not have every movement controlled, or every aspect of my life controlled, everything I ate controlled. And being able to talk about whatever I wanted was also really strange. I think one of the things that struck me the most when I first was placed in that behavioral modification center, I remember that first meal that I shared with my peers in the cafeteria. You know, I was assigned to a table with 3 other girls, and I think I was just trying to make conversation, and I asked everybody why they were there. And the look of shock and fear that came over their faces made such an impression on me, because for them, you know, there was just shock and fear, and they were like, you know, don't ask that, don't say that, don't ask that. And I was like, whoa, okay, like, why? And it became clear pretty quickly that part of the rules there is, like, you do not talk about why you're there. You don't talk about anything that you did while you were on the outs, as we'd say. You didn't, you definitely never cursed. You didn't talk politics. You didn't talk religion. You didn't talk about anything that could be in any way stirring of emotion or real connection to other people. And if you were overheard talking about any of these subjects, you would receive infractions that would, you know, cause punishments. And so, you know, after spending so long in an environment where I couldn't say much of what was on my mind or really talk to anybody, and being so controlled, going back out into the real world and starting high school in my sophomore year was very strange. I didn't find much connection to my peers. I didn't know how to relate to most of them, and I also carried the awkward reality that a lot of them, you know, I was pretty visible as the girl who tried to kill herself in 8th grade, and now she's back after having been gone who knows where. Some of them knew that I was probably institutionalized. I really don't know what rumors may have actually existed, but it was palpable that people knew that you know, I was officially the damaged girl, you know, the crazy girl. And it was hard. It was hard to come back into that and try to learn how to live life like a normal kid. And I was expected to be a normal kid. There was always this feeling looming over me that if I didn't show that I was going to be good and better, that I might be sent away again. And I think one thing that people don't often talk about when it comes to these programs, you know, beyond the abuse, beyond the things that happen, the kind of detachment that it causes is, I mean, there's actually been clinical work done on this, that sending kids away like this just fosters a detachment from their parents and from their family, and really damages the relationship that child has to everyone. And I think that's kind of what happened to me, is that, you know, while I needed help, or I probably would have succeeded in killing myself, but in being sent away, you know, not only were the circumstances difficult and the place was difficult, but it severed me from my parents and from my brothers, and I didn't know how to connect to them again when I came back. I felt very very separate from my family. And all of this contributed to me, you know, starting to withdraw again, and I didn't really know how to be part of my peer group. I wasn't particularly motivated to anymore, because there wasn't much for me to talk to them about at that time, you know, at least I felt. So I turned more and more to a life online, which, you know, back in, when would that have been, 2005, was a bit of a dorky thing to do, but that was what I did. And in doing so, I connected with an older man who very much reeled me in, and you know, we began a relationship that, you know, went off the internet and into real life. And I learned quickly that he was a drug dealer. And after, you know, it's funny because I went into that program really hurt and really sick, but also really innocent. You know, I didn't know so much. I was not a delinquent kid. I was just a really struggling kid who was grasping at straws to feel better. And in being there, you know, I learned so much from the older girls about what drugs were and what they did, and, you know, the kind of this glorified lifestyle of delinquency. And so it didn't faze me that this guy was a drug dealer. It just made me feel like, okay, well, this is more in my realm. Like, I'm already the damaged girl. I'm already the girl who's like seen things that my peers haven't. And so it just made more sense to me to spend time with him than it did with them. And while that was stupid, it's what I did. I was 15, and you know, very shortly after I turned 16, I had been sneaking out of the house at night to spend time with this person, and I stayed the night there. I didn't go home in the morning. I don't know that I really had intention specifically of running away at that moment, but I just didn't go home. And after a quick investigation, I was picked up by the sheriff and taken to another mental hospital. And the relationship with my parents had so deteriorated that there really was no communication about what was really going on with me. And I think the reality of my situation then was that I just didn't know where I fit anymore. And I was sad and confused, and, you know, nothing about my environment had changed. You know, the problems that I had been taken away from were still there. And I just felt really alone. And I think I reached out to this man because I didn't feel I had anywhere to turn. And he made me feel like he was gonna save me or something. You know, I was a dumb girl. But I know that that's a story that a lot of girls share, being taken in by an older person like that. So my parents were shocked and upset that this happened, and they decided to send me back to the Behavioral Modification Center. And I begged with them not to send me. You know, I wasn't in the same situation I was in before. I was not suicidal. I did not want to die. I very much wanted my life, and I very much wanted to find a way to be okay. I just didn't know how to do that. And I didn't want to go away. And I especially did not want to go back there because it hadn't helped me the first time. And of course, I remembered how hard it was. But they felt that I still needed to go there. I guess part of the problem also was that because I had run away, and because of my history, you know, prior to all that of suicidal behavior, there weren't many places that my parents looked into that were willing to take me. And this place is just kind of a send all of them to us place. They'll take anybody. And that's, you know, another part of that problem is that you've got kids in there who are suffering because they were molested, and you have kids in there that molest other kids. And so I did not feel like I should have gone back. I still don't feel like I should have gone back, but I understand that I was loved, despite all of what happened. And So I was returned a courier, which is you can look into courier service. It's a thing of its own where adults are hired to go and take a child and take them to these residential treatment centers. For me, it was just a single female who came and picked me up from the mental hospital and got on the airplane with me and couriered me to the facility. For other kids, it's that they're woken up in their bed by huge men and dragged into a car and taken to these facilities. The numbers of stories of this happening is just like hard to believe, but it happens. It still happens. So I was taken back to the Behavioral Modification Center, and I was not on board. I was not okay with going there. I was really, I don't think I understood the anger, but I was angry with my parents. I felt abandoned, and I felt like I had tried and I had failed, and there was no grace. And I strongly felt like I didn't deserve to be there, and I didn't need to be there, that I just needed my family's help. And I think I just, I started becoming more and more depressed very quickly after I was sent back, going back into that structure and that environment, and being made to feel like I wasn't an individual and that I was a broken person. It definitely broke me down. And not long after I was returned, there was a morning that I remember, you're woken up by a staff member calling up and down the hallways, wake up, everybody, lights on, let's go. And I remember just laying in my top bunk bed, and I thought, what happens if I just don't get up? Like, I don't want to get up anymore. What happens if I don't? And I don't know why necessarily. I think I was just sad and I was angry. And so the staff member, upon realizing that I was not up out of my bed, came in and said, Walker, you need to get up. And I think I just said to her, I don't want to get up anymore. And she said to me a couple more times, Walker, get up, Walker, get up. And I silently refused. And she called on her radio. They called it a dial 9. It meant we need to intervene with a patient. So I was literally laying prone in my bed, being sad and obstinate, and she called the dial 9, and so another staff member came in, and one grabbed me by one of my arms, the other one grabbed me by my feet, and they dragged me off the bed and just let me hit the ground. And I made no movement. I didn't know what to do, so I just didn't do anything. And they grabbed me by my feet. One of them still kind of had my arm, but it was almost like a formality. They didn't carry me. They dragged me down this long hallway and into an isolation room and left me there. And that was the beginning of where things got really bad. I did my time in the isolation room for that, and when I got out, I think I was just I was dumbfounded that this was happening, and that all it takes was that slight bit of disobedience for this to happen. My first day there, I had been so obedient and so willing to go with the program because I so desperately wanted to get better and I wanted to get out, and all it took was the slightest misbehavior for the abuse to really begin. And after that happened, I had it in my head that I was just done. I was going to get out. I was going to escape. I felt like my parents don't hear me right now. None of the adults hear me, and this place is not healthy, and I'm going to take it upon myself to get myself out of this situation. So I planned to run away, and I kind of faked the program. I pretended like I was doing okay and that I was working with them. And when they scheduled a visit with my parents, when they came to take me off campus for a short period, I ran. This is where the story gets hard. I tricked my parents and I ran when they weren't expecting. And when I got to the street, I just started frantically flagging for a car. I just wanted somebody to pick me up. I thought maybe if I could get in a car and get somebody to drive me to Salt Lake City, I could disappear and figure out what to do next. And I was, you know, again, damaged but naive, I guess. I really was so naive when I look back on so much of what I was like as a young teenager. But I jumped in the first car that stopped for me, and I realized pretty quickly that that was a poor choice, because the man that picked me up gave me a bad feeling in my stomach right away. And he parked us under a bridge and assaulted me. And when he was done, he let me out. I was really lucky that he let me out. And I remember walking down this street full of shops in Old Town Provo, just kind of dazed. I think I was still in shock from what happened. And coincidentally, within those few minutes that I was walking down that street, the white van from the Behavioral Modification Center came by, and the men loaded me up in the van and took me back. So, an epic fail of a runaway plan. When they brought me back in, I was strip searched, and my therapist came in to confront me, and she started, you know, kind of laying into me about how awful what I had just done was, that I ran from my parents. And I started trying to tell her what happened. You know, I knew his name, I could describe his face, I remembered the car. And she told me to stop talking, and that I was full of shit, and that I had just turned a trick to get a ride. She would have none of it. Like, she wouldn't let me talk from then on. She put me in the isolation room and left. And, you know, they put me in those pinks and yellows again. And I remember sitting on that floor of the isolation room, and, you know, I understand better now, but during that time, she was with my parents, telling them that I had just turned a trick to get a ride from a man, and then she coached them on how to confront me and what to say to me when they saw me. And she actually, I'd never seen it done before, and I never saw it happen again. But I remember sitting on that isolation room floor, and she brings in 2 chairs, and then she brings in my parents. And I think it was shocking for me, and probably anybody who was on the investment unit at that time, because nobody's parents see observation, the isolation room, that's what they called it. It was really like a crazy thing that they were allowing parents into that room. But she brought them in there, and as a group they confronted me. And I remember I didn't fully understand. There's no way I really understood, but I remembered thinking that the way my parents were talking was really strange, that the words that they were using didn't sound like my parents, and it just didn't make any sense. And you know, that they believed her. Sorry, excuse me. You know, that they believed her. And I did feel badly that I had deceived them to run away. But the reality is then, and I still feel this way, I don't feel badly that I tried to run. I think that was one of the first times that I showed a real bravery for myself and real care for myself, that I tried to run away. So I was sorry that I hurt them, for sure, but I'm not sorry that I tried to get away. And so, you know, my parents went back home to California, and I think at that point I didn't know how to deal with any of it, so I just shut down. Like, I I was sure at that point that I had been abandoned, that nobody saw me, and that nobody was going to hear me. and that nobody was going to help me. And I was placed, I was kept on the investment unit. That's the unit where they keep the kids that they deem inappropriate to keep on the units with the general population. So I was put in those sweats. Here you have to sit in TR all day, which is kind of what I was describing earlier. But I think what I didn't explain was that, yes, you have to sit at the desk for hours and hours, but you do it every day. Like, you sit there every day. It could be for months. And that's your life. At least on the other units, you have a couple of hours a day where you can like crochet or read a book for pleasure or something. But in that unit, like, you're literally just sitting at the desk all day. And in my case, I wasn't allowed to go down to the cafeteria. I was no longer allowed to go to the school area for academics. I literally was in that unit all day, all the time. I didn't go outside for, I think, almost 3 months. And, after a while of this, and the isolation too, and I don't mean the isolation room, but they put me on isolation. I was required to speak not at all to anybody. I couldn't speak to my peers. I wasn't even allowed to look at my peers. And they put me in the only room in the building that only has one bed. So they made sure that I had no contact. To be in a room full of other girls, but to have no contact. And then at the end of the night, make absolutely sure that I don't get to talk to anybody. And after everything that had just happened, to add on the isolation and the monotony, I think I just broke down. I think it's so ironic to me that, after everything that had happened when I was 13, when I was hurting myself and suicidal, I hadn't harmed myself for over 3 years at that point. I was doing better. I so badly wanted a good life and to learn how to be stronger and happier. But then after all of that, when I was in that investment unit, and I actually started hurting myself again. And I don't fully understand why. I think I didn't realize at the time, but I think I partially just so badly wanted control of something. I had everything taken from me, my identity, my freedom, my time, my autonomy. Everything was gone, and at least I had control over my physical body to some degree. And I think that's part of why I did that. And also, I think as a means of protest, after they put me on that unit, I began kind of protesting in my own way. I mean, I was so shocked and fed up by what they were doing to the other girls and what they had done to me that I decided to use peaceful protest as some kind of example, or just to make things a little bit more difficult for them, as a 16-year-old would. But for me, peaceful protest was that I would put my head down at my desk, which was not allowed, or that sometimes I would curl up underneath my desk. And it paints a picture of this isolation stuff that obviously a child with their head on a desk or curled up underneath a desk is not a threat to themselves or anybody else, but they would put me in isolation and leave me there for long periods because of that. And so, it was a period of time of this kind of stuff happening where I was being put in isolation over and over and over, and I was isolated in other ways all the rest of the time anyway. So that contributed to that breakdown. And that's when I started harming myself. And I didn't have any tools, so I would just use my fingernails to essentially friction burn the skin off of my body. I know that's extremely graphic, but I paint that picture because, there was nothing they could do really to stop that. They'd put me in isolation. They'd see me do it. They'd put me in isolation. I would just do it more while I was in there. And so they started shooting me up with tranquilizers, which did little to me, but actually I remember a lot of girls having severe reactions to that Haldol. And for me, they would give it to me every day for, I think there was at least a 2-week period of time where I got it every day, if not twice a day. My parents didn't know this. My parents didn't know how much they were tranquilizing me. They did not know how much they were leaving me in isolation at all. If they had known, they would have done something. But I couldn't tell them. You know, not only was I not permitted phone calls with them at that time because I wasn't doing well enough, per my therapist's discretion, but even if I had said something, and this is something that all of us dealt with, if you try to tell your parents what's going on, all that's going to happen is that your therapist or staff are going to convince your parents that you're just trying to manipulate to get out. And then as soon as you're done with that phone call, you get punished for it. You're going to lose your bed for it. You're going to go to the investment unit, and your whole life is going to be affected, you know, immediately after you tried to talk. And so it's an excellent deterrent for kids talking out against what's happening in these facilities, is that the repercussions for the kid is immediate. And the result is really only that your parents are going to trust you less. So it was an impossible situation. I knew that I couldn't tell my parents anything. And also at that time, based on what had just happened, I felt like they wouldn't have heard me. So I started hurting myself. They started, you know, shooting me up with Haldol. And they would leave me in that isolation room. The nurses gave up on trying to dress my wounds. You know, I had enough of them that I don't know why. I think they dressed my wounds at first, and then when it got to a point where I was really bad, they just stopped. And I remember a lot of times, you know, you're in that isolation room. It's just a cement room with a little skylight window at the top. And it was so cold, you know. I remember laying on the floor in that room, and I would fall asleep after they'd tranquilize me, and I would wake up stuck to the floor because my wounds had started healing to the cement while I slept. And I remember having to peel myself up off the floor. And obviously my wounds were my own fault, but just, I guess that image matters to me for some reason. So there was months of this where I was isolated that way. And at my worst point, you know, those days that I was waking up stuck to the floor, at one point my therapist came in. And mind you, I should have clarified, this is not the therapist that I had the first time I was there. That therapist had actually left the facility by then. This was a different therapist, female therapist. And she came in and stood over me and just said, "There's no point trying with you." She said, "There's no point trying with you until you start trying to do better. I'm not even going to talk to you anymore. I'm not going to see you anymore." And she stopped therapy. So she stopped seeing me for my weekly therapy, which was often short-lived and not productive anyway. But that kind of illustrates the kind of therapist that is probably available to these kids. And I know for a fact that this therapist still works with children in this capacity. And, you know, it was the most miserable time of my life. I can tell the story, and obviously I have some tears about it, but I can't really put myself back there. I can't feel that, and I'm grateful, but it's too deep in there to really access. So after all that time, I was so convinced that I was just going to stay laying in that room and dealing with what I was dealing with until I turned 18 and could get myself away. I really just resigned myself to giving up because I didn't see the point. And I guess in a weird way, I almost wanted to stick it to the man and say, like, well, you couldn't make me, you know? And that changed because of a birthday card. I got a birthday card from one of my brothers who I hadn't spoken to in what felt like a long, long time. And getting that birthday card from him, I still have it, just changed something that I just wanted out. I wanted to get home so that maybe I could have a chance. Maybe I could have a chance to be happy again. And so I decided to just fake it again. I faked everything. I started going along with the program. I did everything they told me to. And of course, they were very pleased about this and made an example of me by allowing me to advance in my statuses much more quickly than I should have. It was really like they used it almost like advertising to the other girls, like, look, Walker was the worst of you, and look how quickly she's making her statuses because she's going along with the program now. And in that same vein, and this is a good point on how they keep getting kids into these facilities, once you get to the higher statuses, they start using you to reel in other kids. Mostly parents don't go visit these campuses before they send their kids. They're going based on recommendations and advertising. And, you know, while they may ask questions and feel like they've done some research, they don't actually go and view the place themselves. But in the rare occasions where parents would come to visit the facility to come and see the grounds, they would send a high status girl to sit with those parents at some point during their tour and tell them about how wonderful it is and how much it's helped them. And they made me do that. And it was against everything in my soul at that moment to tell those parents that they should send their kid to this facility. But at the same time, it was understood that if I said anything other than how wonderful it was, that I was going to be receiving the repercussions of that. And it was, we all knew that. So I will always be ashamed of it, but I did. I lied to those people and I told them that it was wonderful and it helped me and that it's a great place to send your kids. I think I used as mild of words as I could, but I did. And many of us did that. So I finally, I'd been high status for a while and they approved a visit with my mother. And my mother came to visit me and she took me off campus. And I don't know what changed for me, but I told her everything. Well, not everything, but I told her everything that I felt she would hear. I told her about the isolation, about the Haldol, and I told her, as I had gained my statuses and was returned back to the larger population, there was a male staff member who'd begun sexually harassing me, prodding me in the butt with a broom and asking me to draw him naked women. And so I told her about him. And I didn't know this until more recently, but I guess she brought this information to my prior therapist, the therapist who had been there with me my first day, and he was there for a while the second time I was there, but not my therapist. And then he had transitioned away from that campus. And she went to him and asked him about all this stuff, and he confirmed for her that I was probably right. And I'm so grateful to him. Thinking back, I'm really grateful that he was willing to, I don't know what he said, but whether he just nodded his head or what he did something that that backed me up, and I'm very grateful to him for that. And my mom believed me, and she got me out of there immediately. And they put me in a different facility, one that was smaller, and while, I've learned of other stories of abuse from that facility because I was just so happy to get away from the place that I was before, and this place was so much nicer in so many ways. I went with that program 100%. I was still kind of faking it, but I just did whatever I needed to do to show my parents that I was ready to come home. And I returned home, I think maybe 6 months after I had been sent to that second facility after having spent about 9 months back in the behavioral modification center. And I got out, I got home, and I think I was a little bit okay for a short while. I don't think I really understood everything that had happened, and I didn't understand it as abuse. I just understood it as what my life was at that time. I think that's true of a lot of kids, is that you don't think of things in terms of what's abuse and what's not, or what's okay and what's not okay. You just understand what's happening to you and what do you need to do to get through it. And for some years after I returned home, I just fell apart in a spectacular fashion. You know, I was so much worse off when I came home than I was when I went in. And at that point I was an adult and nobody could really protect me. So it was all really backward. So more horrible things happened, and I did more horrible things to myself. And then at the age of 18, I decided against medical advice to take myself off of all medication. And really from the time that I was 10 years old to the time that I was 18, I was on an ever-changing and evolving cocktail of psychotropic drugs that did nothing but muddle me and confuse me and make me worse, if certainly not better. And I took myself off of all of it. And slowly after that, I began to get a grip on myself and get better. And I started wanting my life and wanting to look out for myself. And I'm so unbelievably happy that today I have a beautiful life. You know, I have a family, I have a beautiful little girl, I have a partner who loves me. And, you know, now that I'm 30, I can look back on it all and understand it better for what it was. That, you know, there were times that I was definitely angry with my parents, and I learned more and more, and thank goodness I have the kind of communication with them that I do now, that we were able to repair that bond, and that I was able to really understand how little options there were for them, and how desperate they were. And, you know, of course they were desperate for me to be okay, but that they put their faith in these people, and they were made promises by these people. And because these stories of abuse and the reality of what's going on there never make it far before they're crushed or before the child is discredited, that information didn't reach them the way that it should have. And they just didn't know what to do to help me. So they put their faith in these people, like so many parents put their faith in these people. And some parents don't even choose this. The kids are court ordered to go to these places. I have so much more understanding for what my parents went through with this than I did when I was younger. And for that reason, I feel so compelled to tell people about this, not just so that other survivors know that they're not alone, or so that other kids, you know that they're not alone, but so that parents understand that these things are happening, that the stories are real, and these experiences are real. Just because a child is troubled, or just because a child has done, you know, wrong things in their very young lives, it doesn't mean that we can't listen to them and that they shouldn't be listened to. Parents need to be aware that this is happening, and that it's still there, and that even if it looks pretty on the outside and everybody's making you promises, there are no guarantees that if you put your child in these situations that they're going to be better off than they were with you. And that's only speaking for the parents, sadly, that can care about this. For a lot of kids, there is no help because their parents aren't well enough to make educated decisions, and because their parents are probably more damaging or ill-equipped to deal with them and to help them. But for the parents who can, please, please, please do your research. Look into these things. Listen to what people are saying. And if you already have a child in one of these facilities, please hear your child. Listen to them, ask them questions. Make sure that you find a way to talk to them when the therapist is not on the phone or when the staff are not listening. Make sure that you can talk to your child alone at some point and ask them what's going on, and please listen to them. I can't stress that enough. I wish that I could come in here with solutions to tell you, well, here's a facility that is helpful, or here's a treatment that is helpful. But until the issues are addressed on the accountability in these facilities, like why is there not surveillance? And until there are enough protections put in place and enough training done and enough changes made that can keep these kids safe and can stop this kind of abuse from happening, I don't know of a safe facility, because I don't have that insight. I don't know well enough to say that there is a safe place. So if you can, hold on to your kids. If any way possible, hold on to them. And I hope that there will be more activity about this, that there will be more changes, because for so many kids, they shouldn't have ever been sent away to begin with. For kids like me, I'm not sure. I have feelings both ways, but I know that I needed help. I was so badly hurt, and I had no idea how to cope with it. And my parents didn't know what to do. So yeah, I needed help, but there needs to be safe help. It's not okay for kids to be abused for any reason. And for myself and for everybody that I knew there, and for everybody that I've known, the more I've connected with the community of survivors that exists, we need to make it change. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and please spread the word.